there's something that's happening over here. Now, this event is our 10th Long Talk. I just, for the sake of the recording, Long Talks in the Woods is a speaker and discussion series. Long Talks in the Woods aims to be a generative hive, a place for learning, a place for enskillment, a place where people can come to understand current issues in new ways and consider how they would like to engage. There's a capacity building space for change makers. And so today what we have planned is that Sean will speak for a bit, and Meg and Sam have a short recording and then some talking, and then we'll see where we're at. We're a small group, so we can take a break whenever we need to, and we can have discussion and conversation, and we'll record it all and post it all. At a certain point after Meg and Sean have spoken, I think that we'll have to sort of decide if we're continuing to record or not. Just it being a small group, we had talked about the potential to record all of it, as it's very interesting to have these conversations available. So I don't think you need me to talk anymore. I think I'll pass it over to Sean. And for the sake of the recording, actually, for Sean and Sam and Meg, if before you start your thing, could you just give a little bit of an introduction of yourself?
Yes, and I can give an introduction for Meg and Sam, unless you would prefer to do your own. But for me, I'm Sean Sellers. I'm a PhD candidate at McGill University, and part of Hastings Highlands community here in Ontario, and a co-founder of Long Talks in the Woods. And so today we're going to be talking about narratives of change, and I am starting from, I'm going to give a bit of an introduction before we get into what Meg and Sam have to share. But I'm definitely starting from the place that we recognize we need big change, big systemic change, and we have, these big generally agreed upon goals to reduce the amount of ecological disruption through carbon emissions, extraction, pollution, displacement, while meeting needs for well-being in a really long timeline. So this is where narrative comes in, because how to get from here to there is really tied up with the stories that we tell about ourselves, what the world is, who is important, what causes harm in the first place, and then all of this constrains what we think is possible in imagining our ways towards this goal. I'm sure it's all of us have encountered a number of different narratives of change. As a researcher, I encounter and engage with them pretty explicitly. So I also want to add that narratives of change are sometimes called transition narratives, the story from here to there. And this has been part of human history for a long time. I would say that prophecies are a transition narrative or a narrative of change. It's a story about the world being different in the future, about things happening in ways that seem impossible, or at least different from the path we're on at the moment. And in many ways, that narrative itself helps to envision new pathways and new futures that might not be visible to us from where we are right now. Science fiction really fills that role in sort of contemporary life. As does speculative fiction. They're not all good narratives of change. Sometimes they're warnings. Sometimes they're telling us stories of what the world might be, given certain assumptions. So stories of apocalypse and threatened apocalypse are like this. These narratives of change allow us to see things in different dimensions. And they also reveal a lot about worldview and our beliefs. For instance, what you think will happen in a crisis usually reveals a lot about what your worldview is. Preppers, for instance, I might categorize as having an individualistic worldview in which they think humans will revert to a dog-eat-dog hypothetical natural state of competitiveness, of more distinct gender roles based on very specific deterministic theories of genetics and biology. And this is merely a worldview, a claim about the world and how it works. But it's really good to unpack our assumptions about ourselves and those of us around us, because if we're prepping for resource wars, and if we think all of our fellow beings are just naturally violent and competitive and treat everything as a zero-sum game, in which my survival must come at the expense of someone else's survival, that's probably going to constrain what I think is possible and how I engage with change. So the flip side of this, especially when it comes to the ecological crisis, is some really utopian thinking, like some versions of green growth and green capitalism, or the people who suggest that we don't have to do anything at all, that we don't need change. This idea that we don't need to change very much is like the most utopian of all, because it's the kind of thinking that sort of has beliefs that reject science and the boundaries of the Earth systems, and yet also imagines that technology can save all of our energy and material issues. There aren't, well, I don't want to say that there aren't a lot of people who are this utopian, but there's a lot of debate around narratives of change and which version of the future we attempt to build towards with our everyday actions, our policy choices, our big international commitments, and how those, how we're actually going to meet our big goals for long-term well-being on a livable planet. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some narratives of change that are on offer at the moment that are in the public discourse. A lot of narratives of change overlap. For instance, like degrowth and the ecozoic and buen vivir, like these have overlap. They're not exactly the same, but they're not exclusive of each other. Some of them are exclusive of each other. So I'm going to talk about the ones that I encounter in my research, and I'm going to share a slide just to have us go through this. So can people see a narratives of change slide? Yes, okay. So we'll start with eco-modernism, which I would say emerged from Europe and North America, but actually has like quite a lot of international uptake. It is potentially a doubling down on our current trajectory, that sort of the answer to a lot of our problems, and the mandate for change is actually demands just more innovation, more modernity, more individuality, more competition, more markets, more technology, more economies of scale in agriculture, more cities, more urbanization, that we haven't gone far enough to reach that sort of scale of efficiency, perfect efficiency. And that when we reach a scale of, optimal efficiency, we can create increasing well-being with less resource use. This is deeply speculative, since there's very little evidence for technology that can decouple carbon emissions from economic growth, for instance. The eco-modernist version of the future is techno-utopian cities. This picture up here on the slide is from the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, which I'll be linking to. I'll be linking to all of these in the resource notes for this session, so folks can have a look at all these different narratives that are out there. But this is the cover of that manifesto. It is essentially techno-utopian cities and then green spaces aside. And they're generally conservation-based, aimed at biodiversity and healthy ecologies. But also notably, a lot of these include a lot less human beings. And this is a worldview very much grounded in urban life, the trappings of modernity being good and everything else being bad. I'm giving a real broad strokes here. There's a lot more to be said for this, but or in relation to this. But the trajectory of this narrative is that there's a single version of development that involves us having more robots in our lives and less farmers markets, usually. So then there's some overlap with what is often called eco-fascism, in that it would require quite an authoritarian rule over human bodies, over land, over a lot of choices, in order to sort of imagine this world of a lot less people, and a lot of intense conservation. So it would be a real restriction of freedoms based on the logic of humans being bad and unable to regulate their relationships with those around them ecologically. So we would get a really nice landscape, but we might not get to visit it very much. And there is the extremely not insignificant aspect of how population reductions happen. That is sort of like the fundamental aspect of ecofascism. There's a lot to say about ecofascism and ecomodernism. I have not covered it all here, but it's often tied to something that's called the good Anthropocene. A good Anthropocene is sort of a future goal that is intentionally optimistic. And while it admits that, yes, the Anthropocene in which human activity has had a really incredible impact on Earth systems, notably in the form of climate change, that there's a version of the Anthropocene that could be good, that we can adapt to, that we can make totally viable and sustainable. The mechanism for this is usually technology and some social practices. But the primary critique that I'm aware of is that there's a real absence of a political theory of change, and it really dodges the more accurate truths that the Anthropocene is already bad for people, for ecologies, and the millions of species that have been made extinct already. So a good Anthropocene is sort of a contested idea between those who want to be very optimistic and those who want optimism to come with a political grounding and a theory of change. It also is generally agnostic with what causes harm. And so systems of politics, power, philosophy become pretty invisible within that worldview and assumptions, and which is a choice. So yeah, a lot of eco-modernism and overlaps with this, and a lot of research into green capitalism takes place as part of a good Anthropocene narrative. And this idea is much more, landed in North America, or grounded in North America and Europe. So the Ecozoic is the last one I'm going to talk about in any depth, because I want us to get to degrowth. But the Ecozoic is a post-Anthropocene narrative. It's a narrative of relations as the origin and pathway for change. Specifically, that this era of the Anthropocene that we live in, and in the climate change end of climate change, is distinguished specifically by worldview, by relationships between humans and the Earth systems and beings, as that of domination, of having a right to extract, to claim, to modify, to other. And through that, the worldview becomes deeply human supremacist, patriarchal, white supremacist, individualistic. The Ecozoic then is a narrative of a world in which human relations with ecologies and with Earth systems is of interconnectedness, interdependence, and with the embeddedness, benefits, and responsibilities that requires of us. This narrative of change is then in the relationship, the deep who and what of relating to the world we're a part of. Full disclosure, this is the narrative of change and framework I do research in, so I'm not a neutral party here. And this emerged in North America. I'm going to do a quick description of some of these others. So Buen Vivir is a narrative of change originating in South America, which roughly translates to living well and embodies an understanding of well-being as shared across community and ecologies. This also has a worldview of deep interrelation of beings, knowledges, action, existence, livelihood. This has social, political, and personal aspects that reject the individualism of humans and the subjugation of ecologies to global markets. It's pretty adjacent to the Ecozoic as a narrative of interconnectedness. Other similar ones are radical ecological democracy in India, Eco-Ubuntu in South Africa, the Pluriverse, which emerged from the Zapatistas in Mexico. Land back movement here on Turtle Island is arguably a narrative of change as well, grounded firmly in social, cultural, political contexts and theories of change. And that the reclamation of indigenous land, ceremony, language, medicine, and kinship are part of building futures that are in relationship with Mother Earth. And then we will get to degrowth, and I'm going to let Sam and Meg tell us a bit about that, and maybe Meg can tell us a bit about the Pluriverse even. depending. But now I will introduce Meg Egler. First, I'm gonna unshare, stop share. Yes, yay. So Meg Egler is a degrowth organizer from Edmonton, Alberta, now residing in Burlington, Vermont. She is inspired by unions, collective living, making anti-capitalist folk pop. Her current PhD research explores narratives of energy transitions and desirable futures in resource-dependent communities in Canada and the United States, and the role of the state, corporations, and workers in shaping them. And she will be talking with Sam Bliss, whose PhD research, community organizing, and entire social life center on non-market foodways in Vermont. He is a member of the scholar activist collective Degrow, I assume that's Burlington, Vermont, Degrow US, and Degrowth, Research in Degrowth. So Sam sings and writes songs in a band called Marxist Jargon, which we will be playing some of those songs during the break today. But for now, I am happy to welcome these two very excellent people who will show us a video on degrowth and then talk to us about degrowth. Thank you.
Yeah, great. And thanks for having us, Sean. It's funny listening to those introductions. I really understand why me and Sam are such good friends and colleagues. We also, the music that we play is together, which is kind of fun. But so we're really excited to come here and talk about narratives and change and kind of have a little bit more of a conversation about how degrowth kind of positions itself within narratives of change and some of the narratives that we use, but also acknowledging that we are of two degrowth activists of many and many different groups of people who call themselves degrowth activists, have different ideas of how things need to change and narratives of change, but we can give a general overview. But first, just so that we're all on the same page, we have a funny little 5-minute video that kind of explains what is degrowth and some of the like general ideas that we do all kind of believe in within the movement. So
yeah, I think one thing to add is that in today's conversation, because we're talking about narratives of change, some of the more like technical critique of growth things we're going to take for granted a little bit. I know that John Erickson's come on Long Talks in the Woods, and so if there's questions about like, well, can't growth be green and stuff like that, we can talk about it, but we're kind of focusing on, okay, we assume that there's reasons to like want something different than economic growth as the way to organize society. You'll see in the video, I guess.
Okay, great. Without further ado. Okay, screen share. Okay, do you all see a video screen?
Yes.
Going.
Degrowth is an idea that criticizes any system that pursues economic growth first and foremost. These systems rely on exploitation and environmental degradation at the expense of pluralism, care, and well-being.
We're talking about capitalism. Degrowth is also a movement where critical ideas converge with political action. We see it as a movement among diverse and overlapping movements that share in common a dissatisfaction with the status quo and a desire for a just and democratic social transformation. Degrowth is also practice. Sharing, subsistence, and solidarity economies reduce resource use while encouraging relationship, reciprocity, and equity. And degrowth is also a body of scholarship. It has many branches, alliances,
and adversaries. Those opponents of degrowth spread misunderstandings on purpose. So let's talk about what degrowth isn't. All evidence suggests that growth can't be green. More GDP means more resource extraction and more carbon emissions. Instead of trying to make growth sustainable, degrowth pursues sustainability directly. Forget growth. We're not creating a new measurement to increase infinitely. Instead of replacing GDP with just another number to grow, degrowth is about improving life in ways that can't be captured by numbers getting bigger. Recession is when an economy that depends on growth
We're talking about capitalism.
doesn't grow. Degrowth means reorganizing society to meet everybody's needs without growing the economy. If growth is not the goal, then there's no downside to giving generously for flourishing together. Degrowth replaces privately hoarded riches with shared public wealth. We're not just preparing for when civilization crumbles. Degrowth is necessary to prevent catastrophe. Plenty of societies have grown delicious food, but not their economies. Medicine and the internet can exist without growth too. Maybe these things can serve us better in an economy not centered on expansion and profit. It's not about shrinking everything. It's about shrinking the economy as a whole. Maybe we need more solar water heaters while we shrink the oil industry and weapons manufacturing until they cease to exist. Degrowth is not just less, but different.
It's not just a policy package, nor is it only about reducing our footprints or anti-capitalism. Degrowth is about collectively reimagining what it means to live well now and into the future. It's about exploring and giving legitimacy to the radically different ways of organizing our economy and our society. It's about prioritizing relationships that recognize our interconnectedness and encourage solidarity, conviviality, and care for one another and the planet we reside on. When we come together to enact and envision the futures we desire, we're also creating spaces that promote democratic and participatory processes and allow for disagreement in a deliberative forum. Respecting plurality doesn't come without conflict. Conflict is inherent to any relationship. As a society, we need to explore different ways of negotiating difference and practicing empathy. We're not imagining conflict-free utopias. We're dreaming a better world where we can all coexist.
And in coming together, degrowth as a movement, actions, and body of scholarship has had a lot of spirited engagement. We need to listen deeply to the many other movements working against exploitative systems and imagining alternative futures in many different ways and with many different lenses. We said degrowth critiques any system that pursues economic growth first and foremost. And we are talking about capitalism, but it's not just capitalism. Capitalism depends on systems of superiority and domination, like colonialism, extractivism, and productivism. And tackling growth means addressing all of these. We need to recognize historical and current injustices and ensure that degrowth does not reproduce the same logics that got us here. As degrowth scholars and activists, we need to center not just justice, but restorative justice. With degrowth as a movement among movements, how can we best support each other?
All right, so that's that. Now that we all know what degrowth is, I'm just going to share my screen again. How's that? Okay. Right. So in that video, we found out that degrowth is an idea, it's a movement, and it's a practice that criticizes essentially any system that pursues economic growth first and foremost, and that relies on exploitation and environmental degradation at the expense of pluralism, care, and well-being. So we're going to call this system capitalism, but you can call it whatever you want. And Sam and I are going to talk a touch about how we feel this system can be changed. So talking about narratives of change, one narrative of change within degrowth is that changing the narrative is itself a narrative of change. So excuse the redundancy. So capitalism as a system tells us all kinds of narratives, some of which Sean touched on, which was really great. So like eco-fascism, eco-modernism, this idea of the good Anthropocene are all narratives that do not challenge capitalism necessarily. And capitalism as a system creates these narratives that tell us what we should value, how we relate to one another. So I suppose it's our narrative of change to say, if we recognize these narratives that serve capitalism, can we begin to rewrite them? So our presentation here is like, how would a snail rewrite these narratives? And we consider ourselves snails because that is the degrowth embodied. I don't know.
Mascot.
Yeah, that's our mascot. Okay, so global capitalism is far from an inevitable or natural consequence of human nature. I'm sure we all agree. It's a system of organization that requires both material growth to sustain it, as well as this persistent transformation of both our social relations and relationships between beings and their surroundings. So in this, capitalism maintains dominance through a process that's at the same time material, meaning it shapes the world around us and what we have to do to live well within it. And then also cultural, in that it affects how we think, what we imagine, what we value, what roles we think we need to inhabit, and what roles other folks need to inhabit. And one way that it does this, and this transforming of relationships, is through narrative. So the stories we are told and the stories that we tell ourselves to make meaning of the world. So in these narratives, we adopt different characters and we cast other characters as well. So this is why degrowth scholars and activists, us snails, think it's important to rewrite these narratives of capitalism, both for ecological reasons, so the material, and for our own well-being. No, that was too quick. Okay, capitalism as a process, as we see here, is a process that bounds our imaginations and writes and rewrites these narratives. So I thought this was a funny little comic of how capitalism kind of just like throws on these different hats in whatever way is popular at the time. So right now, we're on the edge of ecological catastrophe. So a lot of the narratives Sean was talking about had kind of like this environmental centering. So we can still have capitalism as long as it's green, or as long as we're decoupling, or all these different fun things that are potentially impossible. Sean also kind of touched on this, so this is not a new concept. A lot of different scholars and communities and different people have talked about how capitalism does this and how capitalism bounds our imagination. So this is one that maybe we've heard before. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And then another quote that I really like is this one by Arturo Escobar, who also writes a lot about the pluriverse. It is precisely because other possibles have been turned into impossibles that we find it so difficult to imagine other realities. Okay, so a way I like to think about this, myself and this guy Gramsci, who, whatever, consent and coercion. So coercion being violence or economic force. So capitalism will create narratives. For example, we are told, if we don't have growth, there won't be any jobs. And then we might tell ourselves, I have to work this job to pay my rent. So this is a very material reality that is true for many people. And it's a material, and that it is like a reality in our existence. But then the other side of this is the consent. So this is where the ruling class, or capitalists, whatever you want to call them, create legitimacy for capitalist order by propagating and having us retell the narratives that serve its dominance. And this dictates both what futures are imagined and which are enacted. So consent having to do with our norms and values and narratives. An example of what we might be told is, your job is important for maintaining economic growth. And then something we might tell ourselves is, I am my job.
I noticed that in neither of our bios did we say our job.
Yeah.
We did good.
We don't have a job. Okay, so what does this have to do with the economy and degrowth? Well, we talk a lot about economic practice. And when we talk about economic practice, we are talking about it as the ways in which we meet our needs and desires. And that economic practice has a lot of weight in our everyday and plays this really big role in our relationships. So exchange through markets is only one economic practice among many. So others being gifting and sharing, both between each other as humans and with other beings and landscapes. So also gardening, hunting, and foraging are economic practices. But what capitalism does, because it's a system that depends on economic growth, it relies on markets as an efficient way to move goods around. And I'm sure Sean would have something to say about this too, that it pretends that it only relies on markets, whereas there's all this other work going on that we're not necessarily recognizing. So that's important to talk about. Anyway, markets being actually pretty good at moving stuff around. They're really good at conveying information about supply and demand through prices and about scarcity. They can take advantage of economies of scale and comparative advantage. So these are all the things that people are like, yay, we need markets, they're great. But one thing they also do is they limit the characters that we play and the types of relationships that we can have. And they turn everything into a market relationship. So degrowth calls for an economy outside of markets, both because these are often more sustainable and because they allow us to play different roles and build different relationships with each other, with other beings and with the environment. And we can write different stories. And because humans often identify and make sense and meaning out of their lives through internalized and evolving stories that we tell ourselves and that we're told, the characters that we inhabit in these stories are actually very important. So this is my funny little graphic. I call this guy Buddy. So Buddy here in the story of capitalism is a laborer, which is essentially the commodified form of humans within capitalism. So he's got his little yellow hard hat. And when you ask him at a party what he does for a living, he identifies as his job, which he goes to make a wage so that he can purchase all the necessities of life. So he's also a consumer in the story. And when he's thinking about what role he might play in society, when he's telling his story of what a desirable future might be, this is the character that he inhabits and the characters that surround him, because the stories become part of his identity. So I like to ask the question, what if we broaden our conception of our economy and allow for different types of exchanges and relationships to inform the narratives we have of ourselves and our communities? So Buddy might also be a hunter who shares meat with his community, and in this he engages in different forms of relationship with his community, and certainly also with the land and the deer. And he finds meaning outside of his more conventional work. Or he might be a forager one day who trades wild leeks for whatever that little brown thing in his hand is with his neighbor. He might also grow his own food and gift it to his neighbors or his friends. Or he might be a builder who shares tools, and a teacher who teaches his friends how to build something. And he might be a different range of identities. And these plural identities can provide spaces of overlap, relation, and empathy that bridge a lot of political asymmetries and conflicting ideologies with a shared recognition of interdependence. So I'm not saying that many of us don't already do this, many of us do, but that this process of capitalism through these forces of consent and coercion is constantly limiting our stories and retelling them in ways that drag these characters back towards the laborer and the consumer. So the hunter, the gardener, the community member within capitalism also become points for sale and marketing of consumer goods and services. So even if you're a hunter, you're a consumer because you need to go buy a comfy cushion to sit on while you're hunting. So I think this stifles our imagination as it pertains to this collective imagining of what a future might hold and enacting futures beyond exploitative systems, which serves capitalism. And that recognizing and valuing the diversity of different economic practices might be something that can open the range of possible futures for social organization within and outside of current realities. Yeah, I guess that's about all I have to say on that. I guess like for a personal example, being from Alberta, a lot of the narratives I was told growing up had to do with nationalism and like pride for being an Albertan, being very proud to be in the kind of like the energy capital of Canada and providing energy for the rest of the country. And then that narrative in different ways throughout my growing up shifted to like narratives of Western alienation. So Ottawa is ignoring us. We're giving all our money to Quebec, like these different things that served the political party at the time and created these like highly capitalist and neoliberal environments. And there's also a lot of narratives at home about masculinity or sacrifice. So most of my cousins work in the oil field, and these narratives are very, very much part of their identities. And then also right now, there's a big narrative about green capitalism. So the idea that it's not jobs versus the environment anymore. It's now jobs plus the environment. So a lot of these narratives are extended into things like reclamation of oil and gas infrastructures and whatnot. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sam. Do you want screen share?
Yeah, keep it on this. Thanks, Meg. Slide here. So I realized that this chart was very small and fast in our video. Actually, I think the same thing. But Meg said this quote that said, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." And one thing we run into as environmentalists is that it's also easier to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of growth, as we've seen with like the non-capitalist experiments of the 20th century in the world. Like they were super growthist and productivist. And so in the narrative about what the economy is about money circulating. It's about, like Meg was saying, it's about producers and consumers and workers. It's about your job. And in our discipline, we don't have disciplines. We were just talking about this. In ecological economics, we think about the economy as social and material. So it's not just money circulating, it's materials taken from nature, turned into human stuff and waste. So I'm going to talk a little bit about like what are the narratives that have challenged growth since 1970. So as we see, there's been a lot of growth since 1970 on this chart. The green line is the size of the global economy as measured in money value of things produced. And the brownish line is the tons of, or I guess billions of tons, of materials that are extracted from the earth in a given year, both through mined minerals and fossil fuels, and also harvested beings, so like agriculture and forestry. And as we see, for every dollar of economic value produced, there's about a kilogram of materials taken. And since many of those materials are fossil fuels, when they're burned, they become carbon emissions. So you see the line below, like carbon emissions goes up a little bit more slowly, but it's a big carbon dioxide emissions are a huge portion of the total material consumption in terms of mass. So back in the 70s, when environmentalists were starting to question growth, their prophecy or their narrative was there can't be infinite growth on a finite planet. And so the narratives were about limits to growth. They're about resources running out, peak oil. We were going to run out of the things that we need to continue growth, and thus growth was going to end, and it could be catastrophic, or we could prepare for it. And so since the 1970s, the global economy has increased. Wait, can we go back?
Yeah, sorry.
I forgot to look it up, so I need my chart. The global economy has increased 3 times over, now 4 times over actually, because this chart doesn't go to 2021, quadrupled in size. And so there weren't limits to growth, at least not in the 50 years since 1970, since people started talking about the limits to growth in its recent iteration. And it's not that we, as you can see in the chart, it's not that we got more resource efficient or that green growth happened. It's that technology allowed new resources to be extracted and used. Material consumption grew hand in hand with GDP. And it's also not that there was even substitution, like some resources ran out and then others came to fill their place. Oil is a great example. So everyone thought there was going to be peak oil in the 70s and we were going to run out of oil. And then all these oil resources that were thought then to be not accessible became so because of fracking, because of new methods for tar sands extraction. And so questioning growth still from the perspective of 2020, we have to be skeptical that there's any external limits that are going to stop it. The problem now isn't scarcity, it's damage. And so I'll show the other slide that I have here, which is to say that like this is a longer time scale. This goes back to 1800, just showing all the different energy sources that humanity uses in the world. Like nothing's been replaced. As new energy sources come on during the capitalist era, they haven't replaced the old ones. There's still, as more biomass, more wood fuel is used today than before there were fossil fuels. And so a lot of this, of course, is population growth, but that's not a separate phenomenon. That's growth in itself. And so as ecological economists, now today, or as degrowth advocates, if it's gone from there can't be infinite growth on a finite planet to we don't want growth. Thinking about the economy from in material terms, we think, okay, so if there's going to be more and more produced every year and there's more and more materials extracted every year, that means mines and tree plantations need to expand physically further and further. And that's like, historically colonialism, and now a lot of like the frontiers of extraction that cause environmental justice conflicts. They go into the Amazon either to cut down the rainforest and make a tree plantation or a soy plantation, drill for oil. A lot of the like poor and indigenous people around the world who are fighting against resource extraction and pollution are fighting against the material consequences or the material process that is growth. And so maybe the damage, I say today, the problem isn't scarcity, it's damage, it's climate change, it's the extinction of species. And maybe that damage will itself one day constrain growth. Like it's hard to imagine producing and consuming more every year than the year before if there's a full-on ecological catastrophe, climate breakdown. But by then it'll be too late. Like we want to stop growth to prevent that from happening. And there's not that much evidence that the damage is constraining growth right now. Like I had an economics professor who would kind of make fun of politicians talking about jobs. He'd say, well, one way to stimulate the economy is to pay half of you students to go out and break all the windows in town in the morning, and then pay the other half of you to go fix them in the afternoon. And in that sense, like having a hurricane because of climate change, do the first part, the breaking of the windows, all for you, it might actually be good for growth in the short run. And so if it's only in the long run with runaway climate change, the environmental limits might limit growth, then clearly the point is to avoid catastrophe, and we need to limit growth ourselves. So the narratives of change against growth, or the narratives of like environmentalism against capitalism, have switched from external limits to collective self-limitation. And so that's what degrowth is all about today. And in so doing, we change our perspective from talking about degrowth is necessary to degrowth is desirable. It makes space, as Meg was talking about, to dream up the worlds we want to inhabit and then create them, or it creates space to define the good life as we see fit and pursue it, in theory at least. And that's like, degrowth as like a set of thoughts and as a practice together. And the broken windows example is one among many that sort of reveal the absurdity of organizing society around the pursuit of growth, extracting more materials and burning more energy to create more stuff and waste than the year before. So degrowth, like the narrative of change I'm talking about, collective self-limitation, open space for these alternative and diverse conceptions of what we want to do. Oops, I meant to stop sharing screen at one point, but y'all know what this chart looks like now. Yeah, and rather than just repeating a lot of what Meg said about the practices of degrowth, I think I'll end it there. Maybe we take a break or take some clarifying questions first. What are y'all feeling?
So yeah, it's 10 to 11. Maybe Why don't we see if there's anything that is just bubbling to the top right now for the next 10 minutes and take a break. But if there's nothing, we take a break and then we come back and talk. I'm just going to try to switch my view so I can see everybody.
Just wanted to say thank you. That was great. I enjoyed it a lot. And I have a lot of questions, but they're meaty and I'm going to wait for them until the discussion.
I'm so excited for meaty questions.
Yeah, bring us those vegetarian questions.
Yeah, I have a few questions or comments as well, but I will also wait. Maybe if it seems like maybe this is the moment, let's say we take 8 minutes, which brings us to 11 o'clock. Yeah, and so, okay, good. And Sean, the recording, should we, oh, wait, no. Also at the break, we are going to put on some music because Sam and Meg are in a band called Marxist Jargon, and we're just going to put that on so everyone can get a taste of it. Sean, you have that set up, right?
Indeed, I do. Yes. I think it's just
And when we come back, we need to sort out recording. Yes or no?
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Okay. I'm gonna just press play and leave my audio on, and folks can listen to this while they go get a cup of tea and prepare vegetarian or carnivorous questions for our discussion section. Okay, Marxist Jargon. I'm gonna start. Well, I like them all, so we're gonna listen to a bunch. The grass is growing, but we don't care. Gonna bring back the berries and the bees. Cabins are empty, but we don't care. Planted carrots down by the creek. And I hope you're not too lonely behind the walls you had us build. I hope your sentry doesn't leave you when pitchforks come up the hill. I swear it's ours now when we dance, only for ourselves now. I swear it's ours now when we dance, only for ourselves now. I swear it's ours now when we dance, only for ourselves. Snow is falling, but we don't care. Changing seasons, what mama chose. Eating's out, but we don't care. We make new blankets out of old clothes. I hope your pleasure crack closed without our flesh to hatch its holes. I hope your sun's not airtight, you won't be able to breathe your gold.
what's the commotion in the streets? Industry was shut down. I went out to be by myself, but you were there with everybody else singing. Our rulers care so deeply about us, obeying them. Our rulers care so deeply about us, obeying them. But we will not, we will not, we will not obey. We will not, we will not, we will not obey, obey. I went out and joined the resistance in the street against industry. I went out to find you, but I found truth and solidarity. Our rulers need so badly for us to be okay with them. Our rulers need so badly for us to be okay with them. But we are not, we are not, we are not okay. We are not, we are not, we are not okay, okay. Our rulers care so deeply about us, obeying them. Our rulers care so deeply about us, obeying them. But we will not, we will not, we will not obey. We will not, we will not, we will not obey, obey. Robots took all of our jobs, and at first we thought it was a bad thing. The robots took all of our jobs, and at first we thought it was a bad thing. But then we realized we didn't have to work, we didn't have to work anymore. Then we realized we didn't have to work, we didn't have to work anymore. Fully automated luxury communism, fully automated luxury communism, fully automated luxury communism, fully automated luxury communism. Robots took all of our jobs, even the jobs we used to like to do. Robots took all of our jobs, even the jobs we used to like to do. The robots don't make very good nurses or teachers or farmers, or preachers or farmers. Robots don't take care of humans very well. That's for us to do is fully automated luxury communism, 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 fully automated.
I realize that song keeps going, but we're over time, so. There we go. No more fully automated luxury communism. Thank you, part of Marxist jargon for that. And now I'm going to throw it over to Barb.
So I was seeing a bunch of talk in the chat, and then I realized actually Tara has not weighed in. But what we have sort of in the background decided we could do is we can record the chat, it's very useful and helpful if people are watching, because a lot of stuff gets discussed in the chats that's beneficial to others viewing. So we would like to record it and everyone know that it's being recorded, and that if you don't feel comfortable speaking in this forum, please use the chat. Yeah, we'll just go with that for now and see how we go. And we have a guide for respectful participation, but everyone here has been here before and it's a small group. So, speak truthfully, briefly on topic, share your experiences with care. Don't interrupt unless you are speaking up for protecting the existence, frustrations, or rage of those who are marginalized. And that's this basic summary of our rules for respectful participation, but I just want to skim through that because everyone here has heard it before. So I will just open the floor, and I know that Sean has questions. If this is sort of a very intimate situation for a long talk, so let's just start. Maybe Sean, you can start us off with a question.
Sure. So I'm having new thoughts about degrowth, listening to this, which is exciting. And so I've often heard that degrowth is mainly a northern OECD country sort of practice, but this is meant to be a political movement for the people who have the most responsibility and sort of like tie into the systems that create disproportionate harm. And at first my question was going to be about how, so Hastings Highlands is a municipality that has really low income, or Hastings County, actually, North Hastings. So where my community is, I often feel like we already live a lot of degrowth sort of pathways because of how much, how plural our experiences of economy have to be already, because we don't have access to wages, like a sort of involuntary degrowth. But so my question was originally going to be about if it's the same narrative for rural and low income communities in northern countries and northern economies or not. But in listening to your talk, I actually wonder if you think it's more accurate to say that degrowth is a political movement for people who are living within the ideological and cultural capture of capitalist and growth-oriented societies and those narratives, and then that degrowth is for everyone who's part of those, and where you feel like I feel like this narrative discussion has informed the way I think about this question, even as I'm talking about it. I know this isn't brief, I'm sorry, but I guess with all that I just gave you, where do you find the boundaries and what does this sound like to you? Thank you.
Okay, there's a lot there, Sean. It was great. So I feel like the second part of what you're saying is kind of the way that I conceptualize degrowth, but degrowth as a movement quickly received a lot of criticism from movements in the global south. And as a result, and kind of always within the discourse of degrowth, it was a very northern movement for economies that were maybe more responsible for a lot of the accumulated destruction due to economic growth. And in that, I think because we are here and this is who we're talking to, we call it more of a movement of the global north. But I would say that generally the way that narratives of capitalism shape our identities and the roles that we see within society, that it can be extended to people who are also thinking of themselves within that society. So I like to at the same time say like degrowth is a movement for the global north, but also that we all need to kind of like break the shackles of capitalism and the way that capitalism kind of narrows us into these very strict pathways of both like our reality materially and the way we see ourselves, but also the way that we're moving forward into the future. As far as more rural places or places with like less material means within Canada, I think that often people just generally are exploited by the system of capitalism. So degrowth is a way to find meaning in life outside of that and to kind of recast the narratives of where we fit and acknowledge the fact that the only place we fit is not within a capitalist framing, and we can broaden this framework in whichever way we want. We call it degrowth, but I think it can be called like a number of things. And like our organizing is in conversation with other organizations constantly. So.
Go ahead, Krista. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, so I've unmuted and I'll figure out how to lower my hand after. Okay. So I'm Krista. My outlook in this sort of avenue of narratives of change is like a land back indigenous attitude, worldview. You know, I think what I heard in like what in what Meg and Sean were just saying is that degrowth, you know, is a northern kind of way of coming at things, but is listening to the global south at this point, is sort of what I heard, which is something I think is important. Like I enjoyed the book Living the Good Life. I like, you know, they've got more practice. And as an indigenous person, like our indigenous siblings in the global south have more practice in this, and we should listen to them too. Anyway, but I'm going to get to my point. Sorry. The window story, I think it also really shows a narrative of how, you know, the criminalization of marginalized groups feeds that growth in capitalism too, and in other forms of growth. And, you know, I just thought that was sort of an important thing to think about in this, because that kind of really pointed that out, but didn't, you know. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there or to discuss.
Yeah, well, so that's a really good point. And like degrowth, as is growth, is like a phenomenon for like the scale of the whole economy, right? And so for growth, anything that like increases production is like great for growth. So yeah, like crazily enough, like you take poor people and you lock them up in a prison and they have no freedom or quality of life, many basic needs don't get met, and yet their material consumption might actually go up. Like it, because you have to like pay for all the facilities of the prison, pay guards, have all this like throughput of materials and energy to keep folks imprisoned. That might be good for growth. So,
and to keep that class committing crime, what will become a crime or what will be classed as a crime. Yeah, just criminalizing ways of life too.
And I think that also kind of addresses a part of Sean's question about like, what about poorer communities within wealthy countries? Where like you know, I see in the United States, like folks don't have secure access to food, healthcare, basic things that folks have access to in far poorer times and places. And yet their material consumption is like an order of magnitude bigger than other places. Even like, you know, during the like economic insecurity. So degrowth really relies on like having our basic needs met. And you know, there's like more like state social services versions of that and more community mutual aid versions of that. And I think like degrowth is sort of like embracing of all of them.
Because there's these needs of our society that, you know, we say, yes, you can live without, but you can actually manage without to get your needs in this society without a lot of those, from, you know, abilities to disconnect and the things you need. Like, you need technology, even if like you don't have, you know, your other needs met, because you need it, you know, you need it if you have a job, you need it if you don't have a job, you need it to find a job. Yeah, there's all these ways where we need all these luxuries, but you actually do need them. They're two separate tools of survival, and we don't really recognize some of them.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And it kind of touches on what I was trying to get at with the consent and coercion piece, is that like if you take away, and land back movements, if you take away people's land, if you take away their relationship to the land, if you take away their systems of governance that maybe incentivize and promoted different ways and relations, then we do end up in the situation, whether we're monetarily rich or poor, where we still need to have a smartphone to find a job, and we still need a job because all the other ways that we have provisioned to have our basic needs met have been taken away. So I think in that too, like degrowth is calling for the recognition of these other forms of economy so that we can begin to value them again, and that so that we can
Yeah.
I don't know.
You even need the technology to receive like the donations to keep like your land back movement running.
Yeah, it's the expansion of the realm of necessity, even when like a lot of your fundamental basic needs aren't met. It's like, it's interesting that like it's so well theorized by economists as like efficiency enhancing, when it's super inefficient to like have to have a series of factories and then more factories to make the parts of the factory and all that to like meet some of our basic needs that like don't necessarily, you know, there's ways to meet them with hand tools. And I think I really love Meg's illustration of Buddy, who's like the hunter and the gardener and the forager and all those things. Because another thinker who's really influenced both of us a lot is Karl Polanyi. And one thing that he pointed out, I guess like many like feminist scholars both before and since in different ways have like shown that what capitalism has to do to instate itself, to like capture people within it, is to destroy your like non-market systems for distributing things and your like non-market access to like your ways to meet your needs from your environment. And so like whatever we can do to reclaim that is maybe not changing the like big political structures, but at least like relearning the skills. It takes more than just getting the right people in the positions of power, right? Like there's a lot we have to learn about relating to each other.
Agreed.
Yeah, I wonder if this is a segue into my disjointed question. I mean, the basic thing is sort of what does it look like? And, you know, you just mentioned kind of like there's a lot of aspects, like there's a lot of things to consider. And so one of them is, yeah, we need to work on skill building and in particular communication, relating to each other, these skills that aren't valued very highly in many situations. So I'm kind of like thinking about, in many aspects, my question boils down to what does it look like? But to just expand on that a little bit, we talked about in Krista's talk. Krista gave a talk almost a year ago, and we talked about disengagement. So how do we disengage more and more from colonialism? And what does that look like in day-to-day practice, and how can we apply that to the many different aspects of meeting our needs? It's very difficult. It's as easy as breathing to participate, like we have to in a way. And so how do we disengage more and more from this? And this picture of Buddy kind of made me think, is it about like, because Buddy still has a job. He's all these things, but he still has a job. And so is it about amplifying all of these other stories? Is it about, because sorry, there is a mosquito buzzing around my head. It's the reality. So I wonder about that reality of like, how can we bring it more into the core? Like, how do we challenge this jobs thing even bigger than, like, and maybe it is from amplifying these other parts of our lives and bringing more creativity. And then it made me think about this thing of like, how much does this then bring it into this conversation of like, well, the individual has to tackle this on these little levels. How do we as individuals affect the larger structure? And maybe you could talk about what your practices look like in towards those things. And also I'll leave it there for the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because on one hand, it's like we are coming from a point where many of us do have to have jobs. Most of us have to have jobs. So where do we find the time to hunt it forward? Like, it's like time becomes a scarce thing when we're having to work 40 hours a week. And that is our material reality that's been created by capitalism. But there's something to me about like, if we can shift these narratives and if we can collectively kind of reimagine what it is to live well, then I think things will slowly fall into place. And also I like to challenge the narrative of urgency, because I think relationship building takes time. And even in a lot of social organizing, it's like, okay, let's do it. Let's do an action. Like, let's get this stuff together. But if the people in the action don't trust one another and don't have relationships, that action isn't going to be as successful. So I think in a way, if we recast these narratives, we might find people having more agency in their workplace, or like less fear. We might see more collective organizing, like unions in the workplace. And then maybe down the road that becomes shorter work weeks, or maybe we build relationships with our community members. So for us, like, I live in a house of 10 people. I'm in my early 30s. That's not normal to my parents. Sam lives with 7. And these are actions that have kind of forced us, both because we can't afford to pay the rent of an apartment ourselves, but also we've learned how to build relationships and rely on one another in a way that actually makes our material footprint smaller, and for me makes me less dependent on having a job. So like, of course, these relationships would be stressed if I just decided not to work. But I do have more time to do activism within my community because I'm being collectively supporting the people I live with, and we share resources and whatnot. I feel like I could keep going, but I kind of want to open the question up both to Sam and Sean and to anyone else. Like, how do we, I guess the important thing to me is like challenging the narrative of urgency, taking time to build relationships, and then letting things happen slowly. But how does that feel to you guys?
I find it really interesting. My like initial reaction is like, we only have 10 years, but
Right.
I know that that's a narrative. I mean, it's not wrong, but it's like bounded within a narrative of how I think change happens, that 10 years isn't enough, when actually, I mean, if the like COVID pandemic response has shown us, I mean, like the many things it's shown us is like how fast changes can happen if that's decided upon. So actually, like, it's interesting to think about if this is a time of like slowing down and building relationships and building networks and not focusing on the policy changes, but laying the groundwork for transformation and focusing instead on like who we need to become to be able to be part of a transformed systems and prepare for sort of what those transformations will be and what they won't. And it's making me think of Krista's project that she's leading with a lot of other people in this area, including Barb and myself, which is refooding the forests, which is essentially, I don't know if Krista wants to speak about that at all, but like that makes me think of this, which is we can't jump into a well, I guess of course we could jump into a brand new system, but that like figuring out the relational aspects in the community building that we assume would come after, if we do that now, we are much more prepared for being together and having solidarity and supporting each other through stressful times, which lots of us have done already in like terms of mutual aid during the pandemic, but it doesn't mean it wasn't stressful. Like certainly there's been a lot of alienation, and I'm going to stop talking because I'm just going on. But yes, I like the idea of slowing down. It sounds nice. It's really hard for me to imagine a life with less urgency, but I like thinking about it.
Yeah, maybe it's more of a change in prioritization, because you can also build relationships and community quickly, but it takes, yeah, I guess prioritizing those things. Like I want to tell like a quick example of mutual aid here in Burlington that struck me as just kind of like, oh, like this, like it kind of hurt a little bit, is our mutual aid network over in the Old North End, which is the lower income neighborhood within Burlington. And a few like strong-willed, I'm going to say, white men kind of took it over and said, okay, what we need is like coordinated action. We need flyers at every house. Oh, we don't have the people, the volunteers to do it. I'll do it all myself. I'll put all these flyers at all these houses, and people will start like putting in requests, and I'll make this algorithm that connects requests with people, and we'll do all these email things. And it ended up just being Venmo names connecting with each other and no people actually connecting. And I was kind of there being like, hey, like, why don't we find a liaison on every street that like knows who the old people are and who the people who have like disabilities are or mobility issues, and we'll coordinate them, and then we can like create these networks of mutual aid, because mutual aid is about relationships. But because the pace of crisis, and it was a crisis, and there were people suffering and needing things, and these needs were met by this guy's system, but we missed an opportunity to do a lot of other things because of the pace of crisis and urgency. And I think in the long run, it's just maybe important to take a step back once in a while and say like, well, like it's the non-reformist reform thing, you know, like we can make policy changes, but what narratives are they reinforcing, essentially?
I see Krista has her hand up.
Oh no, you're muted.
Oh, muted.
So in this like discussion, I think when we, you know, I think about the 10 years too, but one of the things I think about also is, you know, the Zapatistas took 10 years to like organize and build a foundation before like, you know, before that January 1st, 1994 marker. Like there was 10 years of not just planning, but organizing and creating the foundation of the communities they wanted, including defense. So, you know, that that can give a hopeful look to that, but it also brings up the question of like, you know, we know it requires building relationships. So who are we building relationships with? to like change those stories of what our roles are and who we're relating to, because that's part of what needs to change too, is who we're relating to. And then I would say, interestingly, refooding is sort of right now building some relationships that it needs. And I've paired up Barb with an Oneida friend in Kingston who's working on a indigenous language project that is doing a lot of that in outdoors, and through relationships with plants and things. So there's going to be this overlap of relationships that can support some of what wants to go on with that. I need to check the time. Okay. So that's what I had to say about all those things. And I have to go because I have an appointment coming up that I need to prepare for. But so, in refooding too, like it's about the relationships with like the world around us. But also we had talked last year about needing relationships that would, have the refooding group go in a direction that would be healthy and actually looked like the intent of what we wanted to create. And so with this relationship that's being worked on right now, that's building some of that, making sure that there's more balanced involvement between like Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks involved. So anyway, that's what I have to say. And I have to go, and I'm glad I'll be able to listen to it later because it's recorded. See you. Sorry.
Good stuff. We'll keep talking, and it'll be recorded.
Good.
Sam, did you want to say anything sort of in this line, or shall I carry on?
I think Anne might have had a question. Is that possible?
Oh,
I did, but I just wanted to let Krista dive in just because I thought her point was probably more relevant. But maybe one thing that I've been thinking of is just how I think, like I was thinking of Buddy with all his identities, right? And thinking, what does that look like in my life or in the lives of people I interact with on a regular basis? And a lot of people have like a strong sense of themselves as a good person and, trying to do the right things and, maybe a political brand that they really align with. And they sometimes get so anchored into that sense of themselves as a good person or a well-meaning person that they don't see that their form of collectivism is actually anchored in cementing the status quo. And so I've been thinking about this a lot in the past week. Like I would have expected every Canadian to be, not harassing because that's not very nice, but like speaking up aggressively to their various political leaders. But a lot of people went on the defense, like, stop asking tough questions. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out, and I've been puzzling with this for a few years in my head on just different levels, like how do you help people to not feel like so much of their identity is engaged in I am a good person and I voted this way, or, I do recycling and, like how much do you want from me to gently nudge them to do more? And myself too, right? Like I'm constantly seeing the ways I've fallen short in so many areas of my life and trying to be better and not see that as scary, but as actually an opportunity for growth and shared growth. I don't know. It's a terribly worded question, but I'll be interested to hear what you have to say.
I feel like I have a lot of thoughts, but I want to give Sam some floor space.
I mean, yeah, I don't want to suggest that it's biological because I have no idea, but like there's a lot of evidence that like much of the thinking that humans do is like creating narratives in our head that like allow us to believe that we're good people. And so like it's uncommon to be able to look at yourself critically, or even like be interested in like others' critical views of what you're doing. So like part of embracing narratives for change on a personal level or even on like a community level is like being interested in change. I don't know what you're referring to about what happened in Canadian politics, but I'm really curious if someone wants to fill me in.
A lot.
Oh God.
It could be like 8,000 things in any given week, right? But more specifically, just, the stuff in Kamloops and how different people have reacted on different levels and, that whole thing.
Yes, I do know about
Yeah, it's really wild. Like the idea of liberalism is so damaging, or like the
that.
progressive
Yeah.
left, I think sometimes reinforces narratives that are recreating the status quo, like fairly consistently, but there's ways to kind of hedge yourself in that of like still feeling like a good person. But I don't, for me, it comes back to practice too. Like even the individual practices, like, are we composting? Okay, so they're like, make less waste. Okay, I'm going to compost. Now I feel like a good person because I'm taking this environmental action. I think that that's good in itself, but not sufficient, because I think in composting, we also need to get to know like the worms and the bugs that are in the compost and understand our waste. Like there's so much more to it. And I think there's so much more to it that builds relationships and builds this like understanding as us being embedded within this web of life. However, I think the way capitalism capitalizes upon that is that they make it really, really easy to compost. So they give you this big plastic barrel that you can turn, and it doesn't make it necessary anymore to really even understand what's going on. You can just do it, and it's almost second nature, and this makes you feel like a better person without really having to understand what's going on or why you're doing it.
You spend $140 on like a big piece of plastic to do something that you can do in a pile with a couple skills.
Yeah. Like I think individual actions, I don't want to say that they don't matter, because I think if we do them and we talk about them and they become part of our identity, that's actually change making. But I think the way capitalism kind of co-ops these actions is only reinforcing narratives that like we need material goods to do them. We're good people because we're doing them, so we don't need to do other things. And kind of,
John, tell us more.
You're muted.
Thank you. I was thinking that, well, that perhaps it's like, to speak to what Anne was talking about like taking on more as building relationships and being like, oh, we're already so tired. At least that's how I read it. But that like part of the power or part of the sort of empowerment of degrowth as a counter hegemonic narrative or like a counter capitalist narrative is potentially making visible the relationships in terms of buddy that you actually already have. Like we already have all these relationships that exist in our lives, and as part of meeting our needs for well-being and our livelihoods, and that making actually it really visible that we already have relationships and already pardon me, already are living in this way we don't even realize, that then it's actually just sort of like a decentering of our capitalist identity or our wage earning identity, and refocusing our understanding of relationship to all these other parts of our lives that exist. Then it doesn't necessarily actually represent like a net increase in like relationship building, but is merely turning our attention to different places. And I would say that exists with like compost, right? Like that we have the compost in our lives in a big plastic jug or whatever, but like, so we already have a relationship with it, but we don't understand it. We don't have the understanding of it. We don't focus on it. And that is part of the like constraining of our identity to like this one, to a consumer, that instead, if we then disaggregate that into the different complex relationships we're part of, then we can be in relationship with our worms in our compost pile, which I was yesterday. So I was like building up a flower bed, and I was feeling really proud of my little ecosystems and happy that they exist and do all that work without me having to do very much. And I had more thoughts. Oh, my last thought was that I don't feel like while I agree that we do have a desire to feel like good people, maybe it's the desire to feel like you're good instead of actually feeling good, because most people I know either have like intergenerational guilt from certain faith communities, or environmental guilt, or what. Like, I don't feel like a good person. I would like to one day feel like that, but I don't actually think it'll ever happen. But I also am like unattached to that as a goal. So I don't feel like it's like maybe it is a biological imperative, but it's complicated, I guess. That's where I'm going. I'm done. Sorry.
You're enlightened, perhaps. I don't know. I was just referring to, there's a bunch of research that shows that like a lot of like we do a ton of rationalizing of our actions.
Yeah, I think
That's a
that
lot.
it's too what makes narratives of green capitalism enticing, because it's like, oh well, all you need to do is this and you'll all be fine. Like, it's like confronting that guilt in a way that really suits it to adopt narratives that nothing really has to change.
Yeah, that's eco-modernism. And then like there's no social movement for eco-modernism, and yet like what's considered unbiased truth-telling in the New York Times about environmental issues is basically eco-modernism. Because like for the powerful people who control the narratives there, eco-modernism is great because you don't have to like change who's in power, for example. But like even like I want to come back to what Meg was talking about with slowness. And Sean, you said, well, you maybe step back, but you said you can't just change the system tomorrow, and I think you really can't just change the system tomorrow. Like, you could get the right eco-socialists in power. AOC could be the next president of the United States or whatever, and like we're laborers and consumers most of the time, a lot, like, and we treat each other in like by buying and selling things and Venmoing each other money because that's how we know how to relate. We act like little capitalists too, especially if our job is like one of these gig economy jobs where we're basically like a stock of human capital, like driving our Uber cars around, being entrepreneurs in a hellscape that doesn't meet any of our needs, like until we learn how to relate to each other differently, like you could have a different set of people in power and like a lot of things could improve, like a lot of suffering could be reduced, but like, the mainstream version of the Green New Deal or the green stimulus or whatever is basically like economic growth plus solar panels, which is great. It's better than economic growth with oil and gas. Like
More jobs.
take what we can get in some cases. Like,
Yeah.
Sometimes hilarious to watch yourself being a contradiction, right? So just to keep myself humble, I bought this little Bernie mask, the Bernie and the mittens mask. So I had to express my sort of socialist identity by buying a consumer product. So who among us has not fallen into that trap? Is my
Like, absolutely. But also sometimes it's like, okay, so I'm gonna try to reframe that. You weren't a consumer. You like the aesthetic of Bernie Sanders mittens and you're expressing yourself. And it just so happened that an exchange happened on markets.
Thank you for the creative person. Get out of
in a
jail
time
free
when it's
trading
been
card.
so difficult to like interact with, like to find your people and meet new ones, like signals of what subculture we want to hang out with are super important, like
No. Oh, it's all just so funny. It's hard to escape. Like, I don't know. I'm a terrible person. If you send me into a cell phone store, like Sam gives me crap all the time. Like one time I went to get a guitar tuner and I came out with a guitar. I went to go get a flip phone and I came out with like a phone, 3 chargers. And like, that's probably where my heavy criticism
I think the
comes from.
technical term is a sucker.
Like, I'm a huge sucker. And it's because they're really good. Like, marketers are really good. Sales people, very, very skilled at manipulating us. But I don't know. I've got Sam to like shame me for. No, shame isn't. I don't know. I'm just thinking like the more rooted I am in other types of relationships, I think the less subject I am personally to, like, I don't know. I bought a toilet seat on the internet the other day. Like, I'm
Was it fuzzy? Was it hell?
No, it was bamboo. But anyway, so to say,
Bamboo's really sustainable, though, right?
Yeah, maybe.
So we're in our last 15 minutes here. Sean, were you say something just now?
I was potentially going to redirect. But I have a question that's like potentially left field. So if you had a question or someone else wanted to keep it where it was, okay, I'm just gonna go for it. So the question I had was, I was given this question when I was in a webinar a while ago, and I gave a real seat of my pants answer because I hadn't thought about it for any length of time beforehand. But I have been told that municipalism, which full disclosure, I don't 100% know what that is part of degrowth proposed, like part of like degrowth ideas of like where local political engagement should end up, and part of governance in degrowth, and sort of like decentering the state and bringing the state to a more democratic and participatory scale, and that municipalism is part of that. And this was a question that was given to me by, they were asking me about whether I thought that was a great idea. And I think it was a European person who asked me. And so I answered saying that in Canada, and I assume potentially in the United States, that there's a, because the state and because municipal levels of governance as part of the state are, you know, engaged in actively colonial practices of land dispossession and sort of like maintaining market boundaries and enclosure processes, that I sort of was like, we can't talk about municipalization until we talk about decolonization. And I was just wondering if that's a conversation that's happening in degrowth spheres, and if it's not something you want to talk about, you don't have to. But
You're trying to subtly decide who was going in.
I'm gonna talk.
Okay, cool.
Neither of us are like the municipalist people. We have some friends though. There's a network called Symbiosis. We have some degrowth symbiosis co-participants or whatever, buddies. And they are like municipalist movement, what would you call it? Like a confederation of municipalist movements in North America. So like Operation Jackson is one, and there's a group in Portland and another in, I don't know what else, Detroit. And I don't like sorry, Sean, this is gonna sound more critical than I actually feel. I totally agree with the city government and itself is like causing tons of harm, but like the idea that like one thing needs to go before the other, like I think we need to work on it all at once. And like, why not get people who are like want to give municipal land to local indigenous groups in city government, right? Or at least control over it. I mean, some of the places where like degrowth advocates, for example, who like aren't going to use the word degrowth, but people who've gotten elected mayor and in city government in Barcelona, like just last week in Zagreb, Croatia, the like municipalists won the local elections, and the guy, this person, their mayor would like founded an Institute of Political Ecology or something. So like, I don't really know anything about like the politics of these municipalist movements, or like, they call it dual power, but then they end up taking power in like the traditional city government, and that's considered success. So I feel like there's contradictions everywhere. Like the Rojava people are also sort of municipalists in this, because they have this like Rojava, Syrian Kurdistan, where they have this like sort of autonomous region where the Kurds have like some revolution of democratic confederalism. But the idea is like govern things on the neighborhood level first, have like a confederation of neighborhood groups to which you send the delegates sort of thing. And that's like the same set of ideas that come from Murray Bookchin for municipalism. What I like about like doing things on the local level and is like the not collaborating with city government personally. They're a fun adversary for me, but on like I don't know, it would be different to like live in a place with the city government who was like the cool kids were in power. I don't know. I'm just rambling now. Somebody else talk.
That was interesting. Thank you. Like, I'm not wedded to the idea that it's inherently bad to work towards sort of like local skills of government and inhabit those. But I also, yeah, I just haven't thought about it a lot. And there's a lot there to think about doing everything together and sort of have it, yeah. I guess it's part of what the theory of change is, right? Like, is it inhabiting spaces of traditional power and working from within, and how do we imagine that happening? But potentially like participatory decolonization, can it happen at the municipal level? Maybe, who knows? I mean, this is extremely not related, but like, you know, the single-use plastic bans, I believe, came from below. Like, it came from municipalities who were pissed off about their landfills being filled with plastic and actually not being able to afford it, and created a coalition. I might not be telling this story truthfully, but this is my perception of how this story went. That like it was municipal, local level reaction to huge amounts of plastic waste that pushed it up to a federal level. So
If you take municipal government, you can defund the police, right?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of power in municipal governance. I don't know, I'm very supportive. I think that municipal governments are less likely to be co-opted by corporations, though they can be, but I think that there's much more space for this relationship building that we're talking about, that it would, like, information would go through people through relationship if someone was, when I'm talking like small governments, like even Burlington, I think it's 40,000 people and it's like our mayor is terrible, but there are a lot of people on city council who are, somebody coming in, who are working for things that we think are really nice and beneficial and kind of this non-reformist reform that would not currently happen at the state level. Also, I just gotta say, like in Canada, the state level, it's so, to me, my perception, it's so co-opted by corporations that, like, if you look underneath most of the narratives, and I'm sorry if I'm insulting anyone who really likes Justin Trudeau, but if you look under any of his statements that create these narratives that we are this peaceful country that is really into the environment, and like a lot of the COVID stimulus was fossil fuel subsidies. Like my work was looking into tracing where these funds were going, and they were going straight to like the biggest corporations in Canada. So like, do we trust our state? Like, absolutely not. Can we trust our municipal government? We could through relationship building. Like, I believe that we could someday sooner trust our municipal governance and control municipal governance in a way that's good for us, and that we can build relationships with other communities surrounding us. I don't see that happening anytime soon at the federal level in Canada or the United States.
Yeah, I mean, municipal politics do tend to be less partisan because you know each other.
Yeah, and you might go hunting with the super conservative guy that drives a giant truck, and I might be this woman with little hunting experience, but he might teach me how to shoot a bow, and then in that he might also teach or listen to my ideas of degrowth, and that happens at these small relationship levels, and then we might see each other in city council and maybe agree on something because we empathize with each other. But nobody in federal government is like empathizing with me, you know. Anyway.
Yeah, we're kind of coming to our end of our time, and yeah, I guess I don't have one last question, but I guess just sort of like this sort of swirling summary for me right now is this, like, I really liked how you talk about how capitalism bounds our imagination, because I think that is a huge factor in all of this, is people's imagination. And like, you need your imagination to make up a story, and a story is going to help us get to another place. And so creativity is important prep for the future. And this talk of building relations and taking the time to do that, whether it be relations with the worm in your compost or a relationship with the person who taught you how to shoot a bow, is all like preparation for the future. And or just it just is important stuff. And I guess, like, I'm thinking of the Long Talks community here too, where we're trying to help, because a lot of people really want to funnel what they're learning into action. And we're not an action organization, but we try to, like, so I'm kind of listening and I'm going like, okay, like, we can talk about preparing and like making good soil for change. And what is this change, and who and how is going to affect the, like, structural change that we will be ready for? And that is a big question that still lingers in my mind, and I'm not expecting anybody here to have an answer for that, but it's kind of just, I'm just reflecting on that at the moment. And just thinking about how we can engage with degrowth in our own lives, with our communities, and yeah. Anyway, I think if there are no further sort of burning questions in this last few minutes, I feel like just saying thanks for Sean and Sam and Meg for giving us so much to think about, and for sharing what you are working on and knowing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And I promise, my commitment to you is that I'm going to turn some of these ideas into radical and subversive action, because I sense that you want nothing less.
Nothing less. Those radical subversive actions turn back into ideas. You know, like, I think it's the doing that sometimes affects how we think as much
It's
as
like thinking compost, right?
I'm really glad that Sean elaborated on the compost metaphor. Let's all go be in relation with our compost.
Oh God, I was this morning. It's a mess. There's so many flies back there.
Yeah, I'm just going to check my notes, see if I have anything else to say to wrap us up. Just again, thanks, and thanks for everybody who came, and thank you for all the people out there who will probably be watching this at a later time and engaging with the Long Talks community, and strongly encouraging people to look at the resources, because Sean is really good at posting all kinds of information and links and articles and stories that go along with the themes that we're talking about, that really help to bring more perspective or more depth. So go there and look at it. And again, yeah, we're not going to do a session in July, and we may do a August session. We may experiment with a podcast format, based on this notion that actually these conversations that are maybe a little bit bumpier are actually maybe more, like, maybe anchor us a bit more in the information. So I think I can close us off. And it was really nice to meet you online here, Meg and Sam.
Thanks for having us.